Hello, and welcome to the Healthy Work podcast, hosted by the Healthy Work Research Unit at Aston University. I'm your host and head of the research unit, Simon McCabe. Today's guest is Dr Isabella Moore. Dr Moore earned her PhD from Aston University. Her work has focused on later life entrepreneurship, with a particular focus on the gendered aspects of setting up a business at a mature age. Dr Moore is an entrepreneur herself, having set up and run Comtech translations for 40 years, while buying and selling several businesses along the way. In 2022, Dr Moore launched the Olderpreneur Alliance, a community interest company dedicated to supporting, training, encouraging and advocating for aspiring later life entrepreneurs. We're delighted to have her with us today to discuss her work and to connect it to health and well-being. Dr Moore, welcome.
Hello, glad to be here.
Good stuff. So we like to launch these things with you just telling us a little bit about yourself. So before we jump into the nitty-gritty of your PhD and your more recent work, can you kind of give us a little bit about your background, what got you into this area, and kind of how did you end up where you are now?
Okay, well, it's a long story. If I say that my thesis for my master's was on 18th century church pulpits in Central Europe, it hasn't got much to do with entrepreneurship, but it's as I said, a long story. I'm half Polish, and I was at St Andrews University. And I had the opportunity of a sort of funded place at Warsaw University, and this was still under communism, Poland. But I decided I needed to explore a little bit my heritage. So off I went to do history of art there, hence the church pulpits in 18th century Central Europe. And at the time, Poland was beginning to establish technology transfer contracts with Western companies. And I was recruited to work for an American construction company. This was after I completed my degree. I didn't have a lot of money, needed to earn some. So I went off at the age of about 24, 25 to work in this large construction site as an interpreter, because obviously my knowledge of Polish at the time had vastly increased, having to write essays and my dissertation in Polish. So, so I was recruited as a translator, interpreter. For some reason, the site manager was fired, and I was given the job at the age of 24 of looking after this construction site, which was an experience in itself. And at the time, Massey Ferguson, the tractor, there's a large tractor factory here. It was, because it's no longer here, in Coventry, and they signed a technology transfer contract with the Polish equivalent. And I was headhunted by the British Embassy, having heard about my work working for this American construction company. I went off to run a liaison office for Massey Ferguson in Ursus. All the time, obviously, using my language. But if you can imagine, my knowledge of terminology was around art history, not specialist technical terms. So I had quite a large learning curve. And that was where I met my husband, who was responsible for installing computer systems there from Massey Ferguson, and hence how I found myself not back in Scotland, but here in the Midlands. And using that language skill, really, and having that, I worked for several years for Massey Ferguson here in the West Midlands, looking after groups that were coming over for high-level training. And that really got me thinking about the possibility of why not try other languages. And hence I set up Comtech. And there was another big reason why I did this. At the time, it's very different now, but at the time, there was no there were no facilities as there are now, nurseries, all the sort of childcare that there is now. And I needed the flexibility really to bring up a young family. And so that was also one of the reasons. And I think women of my generation often set up in business precisely for that reason, because they needed that flexibility. They couldn't take a 9-to-5 job because they didn't have the childcare. I didn't have my family with me, so there was no other choice. And so that was how I set up Comtech. And over the years, I worked very hard to develop the company using as much help as I could. I was always the first one to sign up for any business support program. I ensured that we were certified to all the usual standards. And also, in parallel with that, I became involved with the Chamber of Commerce movement, and I became the first woman president of Coventry and Warwickshire Chamber, and also nationally the BCC and deputy president of the European Chambers of Commerce. So I was always interested in the sort of impact of public policy regulation on small business. So that was my other sort of area of interest. And also promoting language learning in schools. We're so bad in this country about language learning, you know, and I always say you can buy in English, but you can't sell in English. So that was my other area. And supporting women's enterprise, really understanding that, you know, however much we think we are, but at the time, and I think the situation has changed quite considerably, but we're still not there, is that it is more difficult for a woman to set up in business for all the reasons that I have just, you know, said. There are other pressures which perhaps their male counterparts don't have. Mm-hmm. So, so I worked on the business, developed it, and then I had the opportunity of selling it. And I sold it to an American concern and went off to be chief executive of an organisation that supported the learning languages of school. It was a government quango at the time, and also promoting language learning among companies, exporters. Mm-hmm. And so I worked there for several years, and it was a chance telephone call from the owners, the American owners, who said, look, we don't feel we've taken the company where we want it to be. You've got lots of contacts in the language industry. Could you help us sell it? Mm. And it was just a eureka moment. My daughter at the time was working as a management consultant down in London. I picked up the phone to her and said, it was just a sort of moment. Do you fancy buying it back again? Mm. And so we did. We bought the business back again. And so at the age of 60, I found myself in a very different, it's taken me a long time to get there, but, you know, this is the story. At the age of 60, I found myself with a very different set of issues than I had found setting up a business in my 30s. So I had an aging mother who lived abroad. My mother was Polish. When my father died, she moved back to Warsaw. And she was in her late 80s at the time. I had young grandchildren, and I very much wanted to remain involved in helping to look after them. And I also had a husband who was retired and really felt that he didn't really understand why I wanted to continue working. Mm-hmm. And so I sort of began to think about these issues. What impact do these problems have on somebody thinking in later life about setting up in business? And it was a chance conversation with Professor Mark Hart, who said, well, why don't you come along and do a PhD on this subject? Mm-hmm. And so I did. And so that's that's the journey to the point where I started that research. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you mentioned there a couple of things that I think, well, you can tell me, I suppose. So You mentioned about starting the company kind of as a result of having children. And that was kind of one of the solutions, is because it provided the flexibility to you. And you also mentioned kind of the attitudes towards women and different things in business as well. So how did that translate, and what was the appeal of a PhD? So that's the first question, is kind of why did it appeal to you in the first place? And can you tell us more about what you ended up studying?
Okay, well, perhaps just to answer that first part of the question, I mean, I remember when I joined the Chamber of Commerce movement in order to get the contacts I needed, because obviously I was selling a language service to exporters. So where would I find exporters? So I thought to myself, well, it's the Chamber of Commerce. And so that's why I became a member of the Chamber of Commerce. But I do recall when I used to attend the networking events, I always, think about it, usually the only other woman there was, and this is going back quite a few years, was the lady that perhaps was, serving the buffet or the sandwiches. So there were very few women at the time actually able to get involved in sort of organisations like the Chamber of Commerce. The meetings were usually early evening. If you had children, obviously, that in itself would be a barrier. But at the same time, as I said, you having your own business. And I suppose I just persevered with that, is that, you need that flexibility. You won't ever get that same flexibility if you have a paid job. Okay. Perhaps working as an academic is another, but at the time that wasn't something that I even considered. So it was at the time the only way that you could have that flexibility to be able to stop at 3, go and pick the children up, or perhaps take the day off, or just work part time. So, yeah. And why I felt, I've always, as I said, I've always been interested in issues and problems. So, in my Chamber of Commerce, where I did a lot of lobbying on behalf of small businesses in Brussels, at the time it was the Tony Blair government. So I was down in London often, and also obviously as president of the British Chambers of Commerce, lobbying on issues that affected small business. So, when I found myself at the age of 60 with all this new bunch of issues, that's what I think, well, I just want to understand that a bit better. I just want to see why, what, and I also felt, I think that's one thing I haven't mentioned, that once you reach a certain age, say at 60, you do find that you lose a bit of your identity. You've been working all your life, you've been doing this, and then suddenly, it's not there anymore. And I just felt that also was something interesting to explore. And the sort of stereotypes that people have about older people, this whole issue of, once you reach a certain age, it's the beginning of the big decline. Right. Well, it's not like that at all. Yeah. So, yeah.
It doesn't have to be. So,
no.
I mean, Sam and I spoke last week about this idea of retirement. Many people have this idea that it's going to be fantastic, and then the reality of it is much different from expectation. But I want to return to the PhD.
Yes.
And particularly kind of what you did, and in particular, because it's the Healthy Work podcast, any of the health or well-being angles that kind of tumbled out of it?
Yes, very much so. So I looked at 3 areas. First of all, I looked at motivation. I looked, why would you want to set up in business in later life? And I mean, just to say, I originally was going to do a mixed methods research, but my data that I had from interviews that I had with a sort of half and half, it was half men, half women, and it was so rich and so much that I think everybody felt that it would be sufficient. It didn't need, for the time being, it didn't need that mixed methods, and that just doing qualitative research was enough. So I looked at motives. Why would you want to start in business in later life? And I had some very interesting findings from that. Well, first of all, it's very rarely one reason. It's not just to earn more money, although especially for women, that was a big issue because 70% of women of a certain age only have the state pension to live on. So that was, but it was usually a mixture of things. And one of theirs, especially among the men that I interviewed, was an anxiety and concern that as they retired or didn't have a job in later life, their cognitive skills would decline. Okay. So that came across very strongly. It was something that the men that I interviewed said more than the women. Mm-hmm. The women, I think, were more used to change. And so they were perhaps, because of having to break, they didn't that wasn't a concern at all. But among the men that I interviewed, certainly it was that sort of concern that their cognitive skills I remember one gentleman that I interviewed said that he had in his family, he had a history of dementia. And he felt strongly that by setting up and running his own business, that would sort of stave it off. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something here, there's a strong message here that is, the fact that, people have this expectation of retirement, as you just said, where, it's going to be great, I'll be able to do the garden, I'll be able to go golfing every other day. Mm-hmm. But actually, there's a limit to how much you can do of that. And what came across for me strongly was the fact that people wanted to feel relevant. Yeah. And that relevance you don't get from doing gardening and I think that, and so by setting up that business gave them a sense of relevance.
Mm-hmm. And what about the two other strands?
Yeah, so there was motivation. Then I looked at sort of stereotypes. I looked at how does society perceive older people. And it was interesting. It was very much as I had expected that, people would... I even came across a view from one of the interviewees who said that he'd broached the subject of setting up his business, that it was a sort of deviant activity, actually setting up a business. And, what on earth are you doing this for? Yeah. So, that was interesting, that sort of attitude that it was somehow...
rebellious.
Rebellious and a bit mentally unstable that you would even think in your later life to set up a business. And then there's also the sort of stereotypes that people have. I think I mentioned earlier about the fact that, this is the beginning of the big decline. Mm. And, this is it. It's a sort of mindset. And again, this, that is, I think, very closely linked to the issue of well-being, is that, that mindset is... It's a sort of mental state, isn't it? And if you feel, well, I can't do this at this time of my life, you're sort of, you're putting unnecessary barriers, and it's really about exploring why you feel that. But generally, society very much kept everything in sort of that it was more acceptable for men to set up in business than it was for women. Women were very much around, well, at that age you should be looking after your elderly parents or your grandchildren, and there's really not much room. I don't see how a woman would be able to mm-hmm. to do that. Mm-hmm. So that was the second, and then the third area I looked at were the resources you need for setting up a business. And I divided them into tangible and intangible resources. So just quickly on the tangible ones, it was around, obviously, the financial resources you might have and how you might get them, the sort of business support that was out there for you to access. And it was interesting that most of the people I interviewed felt that the existing offer really didn't meet their requirements. They had, they had interviews with people that were 30 years younger than them that made them feel very inadequate, and that they felt they hadn't been taken seriously, and it just they felt that the people that they saw really didn't sort of understand their particular sort of issues and problems, and it was very generic in the way that they were dealt with. But most interestingly was around the intangible resources, and here again, health and the mental and physical health came out very strongly. I think everyone I interviewed understood the importance of maintaining good physical health and mental health if you were going to set up in business, because one of the biggest barriers was around confidence, the confidence to set up a business. I remember some of these people had perhaps a bruising experience in their earlier career. They might have had to leave their job because of ageist attitudes, because it was, they felt that that they would. I mean, I remember one particular lady said, "I will never work for anyone else again. My experience was so distressing." And so when they leave their employment, they're not always in a good mental state to even think about, setting up in business. So exploring that and trying to understand that, accepting, is part of that sort of process to, in my view, to potentially get them thinking about that this is an option.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I already know quite a little bit about this, but for our listeners, can you explain that you recently set up the Olderpreneur Alliance? Can you talk about what it is, what motivated for you to do it, and again, the health and well-being angles?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was always aware that, that this, I wanted to understand from my own perspective what is going on when you reach a certain, what are the changes and how your perspective changes towards setting up a business. But I really felt that, doing this research needs to lead to somewhere just to have the impact that is so necessary. I mean, what's the point of doing it? So I think with the findings I had, I just felt very strongly that I needed to do something. I have my own example to go by, so it's not sort of, so I felt I really needed to get this message across. And so I set up a community interest company called the Olderpreneur Alliance. And on the basis of these findings, I designed a program called the Later Creator. So it's very much, first of all, perhaps I'll tell you what it's not.
Yeah.
It's not about business planning. It's not about cash flow. It's not about marketing. It's about understanding what the barriers are to even considering this option. And after I finished my research, I wanted to validate some of it. So I did a survey which went to 5,000 people in this age bracket just to confirm. I just felt I just needed a wider confirmation of what my research findings were. And one of the things that came out very strongly was that people in this sort of age bracket, in this demographic, often went for jobs for which they were vastly overqualified. And why? It's because they felt nobody wanted me, and they were going for jobs they needed the money, but they didn't even consider that, there's no point in, they didn't even, I think about what they have to bring to the table. And the skills and experience I called age capital. Mm-hmm. So it's what age capital they have to be able to offer a potential employer. Mm-hmm. So the Later Creator is not only about considering, because not everybody's going to set up a business, that's not going to be an option for everyone. But it's very much about getting to the point where you understand what your age capital is, and being able to feel confident enough to either go and get the sort of employment that reflects your skills and experience, or be confident enough to be able to access this sort of business support is out there to take you to the next level. Mm-hmm. So that's the purpose. And also the other aim of the Olderpreneur Alliance is just to raise awareness about, I think obviously there has to be an emphasis on supporting young people. It's our future and we need to do that. But there's a lot of people out there. I think I read a statistic that by 2040 there'll be several more million people of pensionable age that probably will not be able to support themselves on the state pension.
Absolutely. So the economists are always talking about the demographic time bomb, which is exactly what you said. People are not, at least they're not saving the amount of money they would need to continue the lifestyle that they had while they work. They're going to have to take a significant hit to the quality of their lived life. And
that's a shock in itself.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that you mentioned several times there was this idea of self-esteem or confidence or self-belief. and that it's sort of driven by multiple things, including ageist attitudes. What do you feel and expectations around old age, self-imposed expectations around what old entails in terms of your day-to-day work? What do you feel needs to change in society?
Well, I think what I felt when I was conducting those interviews is the people themselves sometimes were their own biggest barrier, because they were also taking on board these stereotypes. Mm-hmm. So they were also thinking, well, how can I, what will my colleagues say? I remember reading a very interesting paper about a golf club, and there was some research done, and one of the members of the golf club decided to start a business, and he was ostracized from his fellow golf club members because he was doing something different from what everybody else. So there's this sort of attitude about being slightly deviant. And of course that has to change. And I think our media has a huge role to play, mm-hmm. Because they need to start portraying older people in a different light. Yeah. We tend to because I classify myself in this group. Mm-hmm. So we seem to be sort of portrayed in a way which I've said is like the beginning of the big decline.
Absolutely, it's interesting. Sam and I were speaking last week about kind of the existential crisis that's being faced by younger people at the minute, feeling disenfranchised, feeling like work isn't really worth the reward, not being able to get onto the housing ladder. It feels like the bookends of life are really challenging periods, and they both have this common thing, which is a lack of sort of confidence, or in some ways hope, that starting a business is something that I could achieve. And again, to return to this age time bomb, we're only going to see this demographic is only going to get bigger and bigger.
It is indeed, yeah.
And I think that norms are just going to have to shift, aren't they, in the response to the fact that they will simply be more visible older folks around. Yeah. And I think that beyond to just take the conversation a bit bigger than entrepreneurship and retirement and stuff, is that the whole culture and the whole way that we do things is not well tailored to people of an older age. Even if you think about accessibility options for buildings, even if you think about the marketing, Sam and I touched on this, and you mentioned it as well, the idea of feeling irrelevant. Yeah. The music isn't about you anymore. It's not targeted at you. Exactly. The movies aren't.
And you've got to shout really hard to get yourself heard.
Yeah. And if you're of a certain age, you're only allowed to listen to 60s music or 70s music, and it just feels like, I feel I'm optimistic that things are going to shift, and attitudes towards the elderly are going to get better because they have to. Just the sheer fact that they're going to be more visible. They're the people, they still have money to spend, so the companies will still want to tap into them on some degree, and the fact that they're going to become a bigger market share over the years is really interesting. So,
but the other thing, could I just say that employers need to have a slightly different attitude towards older people. I hear time and time again still, despite there being legislation against, employment legislation against ageism at work, it still happens in a sort of, in an unseen way. Yes. And that has to change, because I think employers need to understand that, you might do it slightly slower, mm-hmm. whatever job, but that doesn't mean to say you haven't got the skills and experience to deal with it and use that. Mm. And I think employers' attitudes do need to change too.
Yeah, I think the employers' attitudes, but also what you mentioned as well, which is people themselves and their self-belief. Often some of these people have been in the same job for 40 years, and when they're made redundant, the question is there even anybody out there that would want me? And so there are organisations like the Centre for Healthy Ageing, I believe it is, and they have things like the age-friendly pledge that companies can choose to sign up for, to say that they don't discriminate in the recruitment process, and that they'll adopt flexibility for older workers and things like this. So Yeah.
And it is about exploring what these barriers are. What is it that and this is what the Later Creator program does. It really breaks down. I mean, for example, how do you sell if you set a business in later life? How do you sell to somebody who is perhaps 30, 40 years younger than you? That is a real confidence-draining activity. Yet if you want to, you can do it, and there are strategies you can adopt. How do you deal with the bank who's telling you that, the house that you've worked for all your life, they want that as collateral? How do you deal with that? How can you develop a strategy? How do you build up that resilience and perseverance? And going back to the well-being aspect, it is about maintaining good physical and mental health. That is hugely important.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Moore, what is next for you?
Well, I am currently talking to several organisations about launching the Later Creator programme. We ran a very successful pilot in Scotland, and of the 15 people that signed up, 3 decided to not to go ahead with setting up their business, but went into employment, but felt that they were more confident after going through the programme to look for the sort of employment that they wanted. And the rest have set up businesses. These are not big businesses, but they're businesses that you can run from home, that give you the flexibility to do the things you want. But they earn the income, the additional income that you need. So it's very much about developing and carrying on with my work in the Olderpreneur Alliance, yes.
Very worthwhile stuff. So a couple of final questions then, because we have student listeners on the programme. Do you have any advice for students who would want to start their own business? What would you tell an 18 or a 19-year-old?
You've got to feel really passionate about something. You've got to really believe in that. Just thinking of this idea or that might work, but because what you need is that resilience and perseverance to keep going. When you set up a business, I mean, statistics show that the first couple of years are crucial. So you've got to be able to keep going. And use as much support as is out there. You will not know everything. One of the first things I gave up and subcontracted were the accounts in the business, because I didn't enjoy. So get as much support, go to all the different organisations, the Chamber of Commerce, the Growth Hubs. There's a lot of help out there, but be clear what you want.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the second question is, if you could go back in time and talk to yourself, what one piece of advice would you give to your younger self?
Well, when I was thinking about my PhD, is that you've got to start writing immediately. Don't keep thinking as I didn't have much experience in academic work, thinking that the next 10 papers might give me the answer. And you always think, I'll just read this, I'll just read that. So I would certainly advise just writing something every day, even if it's just for 15 minutes, but just get used to because at the end of that research, there's an awful lot of writing to do.
Absolutely. I'll tell my PhD students to listen to this clip in particular. Dr. Moore, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.